Hi, I'm Todd Jones, host of the podcast Pressbox Access. Here's a clip from my interview with Christine Brennan. Christine recalls being in the middle of the scandalous figure skating soap opera involving Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan.
Nancy Kerrigan and Tonya Harding. It's hard to believe it was 1994, but you were right there in the heart of all that. When I say Nancy and Tonya, what comes to mind for you?
The most amazing story I've ever covered, Todd. You describe a little bit of it, and people now will go, "Yeah, that was a big deal." No, I mean that story took over the nation and, in many ways, the world for 6 or 7 weeks, and it just had this incredible drumbeat and momentum going. And it started January 6, 1994, with the attack on Nancy Kerrigan's knee.
There's something about
And
January
this was
6th and attacks. I don't, just.
Yeah, I know. In fact, I always think of January 6th and Tonya Nancy, and of course this year, terrible, that deadly insurrection,
But
unfortunately.
but were you in
But
Detroit when the attack
I
on
was.
Nancy happened? Where were you when
I
it was in
was.
Cobo Arena? Where were you at the time when she was struck by what later we've learned was a baton by somebody we didn't know who this was? This person shows up and hits her in the leg. Nancy Kerrigan, the great figure skater at the U.S. Championships. Where were you at the time, and were you in the arena?
I was in the other arena next door, Joe Louis, at which, of course, as you know, they are connected. And Cobo Arena was the practice arena, and that's where the women were practicing. And normally I would have, as the Olympics writer for the Washington Post at the time, covering those national championships, which were also the Olympic trials for the Lillehammer Olympics a month later, normally I would be watching the women practice. But in this case, the pair's short program was going on. So I was sitting in a relatively empty Joe Louis Arena. Obviously, some fans were there, but in press seating, in just in one of the sections, with a group of Olympic writers, and including Randy Harvey of the LA Times, Phil Hirsch of the Chicago Tribune, and a few others. And someone came by and said that Nancy Kerrigan had been mugged. Now,
What?
as only this could be in figure skating, right? You're kind of like, what? But meanwhile, there's a pair out there skating.
Right.
Music is playing, and it's this classical music or whatever, and it's figure skating at its finest, and kind of whatever it is, whimsical, kind of interesting, bizarre sport. And so this pair is skating, and so none of us get up because we're just kind of, what was that? But we're watching this pair skate. So the moment the music ends, none of us spoke to each other, about 5 or 6 of us Olympic writers. The music ends, and immediately all 5 or 6 of us just shoot up, stand up, and without saying a word, just file into the aisle and go down in an elevator to the press room in Joe Louis. And I looked at the press chief, the spokesperson, the chief PR person for U.S. figure skating, a woman named Kristen Matta. I looked at her. She was sitting at a table, and I just looked at her. And I can't, I know that obviously people listening can't see it, but I kind of did that shrug, like put my hands out like, huh? Kind of this look. And she had this pronounced nod of her head, like, yes. So without saying a word, I had said, like, could this be true, without her even knowing what I'm asking? She's nodding yes. And we were off and running on the wildest, craziest, most amazing story I have ever and will ever see in my journalistic career.
No, I want to carry this through because it did go on for weeks, because this was leading up to the Olympics. Really, it was every day in January and February. I was not there. I was covering college basketball at the time in Cincinnati. And I got to be honest, like, my idea of figure skating at the time in my career, I thought, I just kind of thought it was a joke. I remember once writing a column, the very lazy thing where you just rip the sport. And to tweak my mother, I cut it out and I mailed it to her, because my mother, my late mother, she worshipped figure skating. Like, Dick Button was a saint in our house. So I send her this column, and a couple of days later, she writes back to me and says, or she didn't write back. She called me and she said, "You're an asshole."
That's your mom.
But what
Yeah.
I realized, though, is that I thought it was crazy, but it meant a lot to a lot of people. And why do you think that story just caught on like brush fire?
At the time, Todd, by the way, you were not alone among a big segment of our population, probably mostly like guys, who were thinking, skating, okay. I mean, Peggy Fleming, yeah. Dorothy Hamill, sure. Every boy wanted to date her and every girl wanted to be her. That's when we were in high school and Dorothy Hamill won in '76. So those kinds of things. But it turns out at the time, figure skating was the second most popular sport on television to the National Football League in terms of ratings. Your listeners are going to just keel over at this, but this is a fact. It is true. In 1996, so 2 years after Tonya and Nancy, the World Championship, Figure Skating World Championships in Edmonton, covered those, covering everything, of course, at the time. Once this just took off, the sport just took off in popularity. And the men's long program, the men's final at the World Championships went head-to-head with the NCAA men's basketball tournament. I think it was the Sweet 16. And figure skating beat it head to head in TV ratings. And it wasn't a minuscule decimal point. It was like 2 or 3 points. It was like a 9 something to like a 7 something in ratings.
Well, I know my mother was watching.
But you know what it was? It was women's football. Women took the remote control and said, honey, sit down and watch or leave the room. I'm in charge. And this is, of course, the time when we don't have Twitter and the internet and 2 or 3 televisions in a house. So it really was extraordinary. I think it was an eye-opener, not just with you and your mom, but with so many people, just how big a deal figure skating was. Frankly, for me, I'd covered it for a few years at that point. I first started covering it at the '88 Olympics in Calgary, the Battle of the Bryans and the Battle of the Carmens, and it was a very big deal then. I mean, just you knew that the Olympics, it was huge TV ratings. It was must-see TV, but you didn't necessarily know that an Olympic trials would be that big of a deal. And I think it also, let's face it, there was an element of sexism there. It's like, oh, come on. They're wearing makeup and sequins and this is silly and this can't be a sport. Well, we know hockey players, spend a minute and a half on the ice and come take a break. And that 4-minute long program for the women and 4.5 or whatever for the men is, that no one comes out and relieves you and replaces you. You just got to keep going. Granted, you're not being checked into the boards, but it's a different, at least you shouldn't be unless Tanya's around. But, that's the kind of, I think this was all new for people. And that's one of the reasons it became such a big deal. So literally, I'm on the front page of the Washington Post almost every day with this story. What? I mean, who would have thought that? You remember, it's the lead story on NBC, ABC, CBS every night. It was the first reality TV story, frankly.
That's a great point.
That's what Yeah. This is about 4 months, right? 5 months before O.J.
Simpson trial, right.
And 2 dead bodies. And this was about a bruised knee that spurred Nancy Kerrigan on to the greatest performance of her life. She recovered. She was okay. So it's the most famous bruised knee in history. And so you could kind of laugh about it, even though it wasn't funny. But once Nancy was okay, once she recovered, we knew she was going to compete. She skated great. I thought she should have won the gold medal. She won the silver. Then you could kind of smile at it. And I remember there to be times in Norway, I'm writing for the Post. It's 3 a.m. in Norway. I'm still on deadline back in Washington, D.C. because of the time difference. And I'm writing a quote from one of Tonya Harding's, stooges, this gang that couldn't shoot straight. And I just start giggling and laughing to myself because it just was the craziest, weirdest story. And for me personally, it's when I started doing television work. And everyone, if you could put 2 sentences together and say anything about figure skating, and I'm almost 6 feet tall. I was never a figure skater. I was an athlete, but never skated. But if you could talk a little bit about the sport, there was such a craving, such a thirst, Todd, for information about any piece of this story. As I said, never seen anything like it. I don't think I'll ever see it.
What was it at Lillehammer at the Olympics when they took the ice, especially at that practice session? I remember that being a big deal where they were both going to take the ice. You're inside the arena. How big was that arena? What was it like inside there when that moment happened?
There were two. Yeah, there were two arenas. One was the main arena, several thousand seats, probably 4 or 5,000, 6, whatever. That was the for the competition. So it looked like a regular, like a relatively smallish basketball arena, obviously with an ice surface. But then next door was the practice arena. And as luck would have it, the first time that Nancy and Tonya took the ice together, keep in mind now we're starting to find out that Tanya's live-in ex-husband, the adjectives were fabulous on this story. Live-in ex-husband, Tonya was a chain-smoking asthmatic, couldn't make this stuff up, that they were involved in the attack on Nancy Kerrigan. That's what started to develop over the month between the attack and the time everyone came to Norway. And so that first practice where they would both be on the ice because there was a $20 million lawsuit that Tonya and her attorney filed against the U.S. Olympic Committee, and so the USOC caved and let her come to the Olympics. even though we found out, of course, she had a part to play in the attack on her rival, which then you should not be an Olympian. But she made it, and it turned out to be even more of a circus and even more of a story. And now their first time they're on the ice together is in this smaller arena. I've never seen a place more packed in my life. You can picture 300-400 journalists, most from the U.S., on basically a balcony. The fact that thing didn't come crashing down, collapsing under the weight of all of us, including people like Dick Schaap and Bill Conlon and Mitch Albom.
Well, I'm saying, especially with sports writers standing there, right? I mean,
Exactly.
We're not talking about fitness here.
No. So everyone's on there, and I mean, it was so packed in that that there was Midori Ito was a great Japanese skater, an Olympic medalist who was now working for Japanese TV, and she's tiny. And I remember her sneaking her way and snaking her way between people's legs just to try to get somewhere in this mass of people that were jammed in so tight. And Harvey Schiller was the U.S. Olympic Committee at the time, executive director, CEO, whatever. And he looked up, and I remember he had one of those huge, big Maxwell Smart cell phones, like the shoe phone. And I had one too, with the big cord coming out of it, the brick. And I remember calling him, and he just looked up and he kind of waved. I don't think he could even see me. It was just this mass of people, but he just started laughing his head off at what this looked like over there. And then they skated and practiced, and the click, 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 click of 1,000 cameras as they pass by each other, and people can Google it and look up those first few pictures. Nancy's in the white dress. Actually, it was an in-your-face move from Nancy Kerrigan, because that was the white dress she was wearing when she was attacked. The why me video that's so famous. And then Tonya's in some floral thing. And that's the picture where they cross paths a few feet apart on the ice as they skate by each other, and the camera clicking, the whirl of those shutters was extraordinary.
Well, again, it just transcended sports. It became like it was a great point that you made about the OJ trial. The murders happened a few months later. That trial obviously took on a life of its own. I heard OJ played football. but what I'm saying is it became like sports and culture. It just all meshed together. That was something about the time that we were living in 1994 that just brought something like this to life. And really kind of like it changed your career, right? I mean, you went on from there, to write The Inside Edge, a book that Sports Illustrated has said is one of the top 100 sports books of all time. And that led you to the job you have had since at the USA Today with being a columnist. So really, Nancy and Tonya played a part in your career. Is that right?
Absolutely. You will not find many serious journalists who would say this, but I will. Tonya Harding changed my life. Obviously, again, I'm not making fun of someone attacking someone, clearly. But again, because Nancy Kerrigan survived, thrived, and is great to this day. Obviously, it's not the same thing as it's like OJ, as we described a few months later, with two people murdered. But I think what it was for me was, and I tell young journalists all the time, you just never know what story it's going to be. You probably feel this way, Todd, about your career. That's going to be this thing that happens. I mean, who would have ever thought after 3 years at the Miami Herald, and at this point I've been at the Washington Post for almost 10 years. And so I've covered all this, but then I moved to the Olympics, which is, I always loved the Olympics as a girl growing up in Toledo and watching every second of the Olympics back before you could tape anything. If you got home at 8:15 and they started at 8 o'clock on ABC with Jim McKay, they were gone forever. And so I just couldn't get enough of the Olympics on television and reading about them. And so that was the beat that I then moved on to after Washington's Super Bowl in '88. So, but you never know. I mean, who would have thought that it would be a figure skating story that would then, I would be able to write Inside Edge, which became a bestseller, and then get another book deal, which then reflected the success of that book, and then left the Washington Post. Nothing was wrong. It was just I wanted to have all these.
And all of a sudden, you're like a figure skating. You're the person that a guy like me shows up at the Olympics later and says, "What's a toe loop?" Can you help me here, Christine? And thank you. You were always helpful when I had those type of questions. But what I mean is, like, you helped educate the rest of us when we had to show up every 4 years and figure out what's going on here. Because again, my appreciation grew for the sport. Past the days when I wrote that column for my mother. All right, before we leave that topic, give me your best Nancy Tonya story.
Well, I think there's when I think about the craziness at the Olympic Games, and it was nuts. It really, the whole story, everything that was happening, it was just this crescendo building, and it all just drops into the beautiful, pristine countryside of snow-covered Norway. And there was a lot happening. I mean, any hiccup, any sneeze, and it was major news. Tonya, Nancy, you couldn't get enough of it. And I remember a dear friend, in fact, the spokesperson for the U.S. Olympic Committee at the time, I think you knew him as well, passed away last year, Mike Moran. And Mike was in the center of this hurricane constantly. And they had this press conference about 2 a.m. in Norway. It was the day of the opening ceremonies. We'd already covered the opening ceremonies, frozen. It was brutally cold, writing story after story. And now 2 o'clock, they're going to have this press conference in the morning. And they're announcing Tonya Harding is going to be coming to the Olympics. And with that, all the U.S. Olympic Committee executives and officials leave the room, as we have nothing but questions of how this
right.
is going to happen.
They're gone.
And poor Mike Moran is standing there, and there's a picture that actually a dear friend of his sent me after he passed away. Mike in the eye of this hurricane, and you can see the back of my head. You can see all, there's probably 150 journalists all gathered around, and Mike looks like literally the eye of the hurricane. And I remember asking Mike, I was kind of on his back shoulder, back right shoulder. I remember asking Mike this question as he's just getting peppered with questions, including, are they going to live together? Because there was like an apartment.
Oh, wow.
Yes, they were. And so I asked the key journalistic question, Todd, are they going to be brushing their teeth next to one another?
What was the answer?
And Mike Moran, who was a good friend then, obviously, and a colleague, of course, and someone I quoted a lot, and became an even better friend. He turns slowly, like slow motion, and he gives me this look I will never forget, this glare. He says not a word, which is one of the first and only times Mike Moran didn't have something to say. He glares at me, and he just turns his head back, and he goes, next question. But I think they might have been brushing their teeth next to one another, which again, when you consider that one, the ex-husband and others of the one attacked the other, and Tonya admitted knowing about it, actually I thought it was a good question, but Mike Moran was having none of it.